welcome. Appreciate you taking the time to discuss some continuity items today. This is one of the series that MHA does on a regular basis, where we have different topics related to continuity concepts. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about disaster recovery plan, really more from a technical perspective on the IT side of things as opposed to the non-IT side of things. So hopefully there'll be some information. This will probably be more of an intro type of information, not going to be getting down into the deep, dark technical details of IT DR, some of the more conceptual things, so that it's related both more so from an overall continuity perspective. But if you do have some technical questions, I'm more than happy to answer those as well. Just for those that might not know anything about MHA, if you're new to us, we've been around for over 20 years, started by Michael Herrera, who was a regional vice president of Bank of America, handling continuity efforts. Started the firm, and we've been working through from there. I've been with MHA for about the last 15 or 16 years, working with them. Very fortunate to do so. And as you can see, we've got clients across multiple industries, but our practice goes across everything that we have. But the goal is to make sure that organizations are actually prepared for types of events, not just necessarily to check off boxes. We really want to be a partner and an advisor to organizations in the true sense of the word. Try to give you the real information, something that's relevant to you, not necessarily just cookie cutter. Even though sometimes it might feel that way, but we try to do the best we can. Myself, I handle both sides. I do the technical IT pieces, as well as I do the business continuity pieces as well. So this is just kind of, we go across all the different verticals, as you can see, from services to education, healthcare, financial institutions, etc. Also insurance, travel, utilities, private sector, public sector, and manufacturing. And in the work that I do, I think I've gone through every single one of these, and many of the current clients are across these multiple verticals. So one of the advantages that MHA brings is not only can we look at from the size of your organization, but can bring in a lot of different experience and insights from other organizations that could still be pertinent to yours as well. One of the things, as I mentioned, we go across the entire suite of business continuity. So we can go from all the way from assessments to implementation, to running a program, and continuous improvement exercises. But all of these can also be done just as a drop-in point solution. So if you just need some help with documentation, you need some help with the strategy, you need some help with exercises, whatever it may be. We kind of do small but also large. Many of our clients we've been working with for a number of years and really help them manage their programs. But it really is end-to-end, everything around continuity. The other thing that we have, just so that you're aware, is we have a set of tools that we use in our consulting practice, but also is available for organizations to use as a SaaS solution across continuity management from these 5 different areas. The first 4 are the ones that are usually used from compliance confidence, which really is assessing the current state of your environment or the state of your environment against all the various standards that exist out there. So you can give yourself a score and see where are the areas that need improvement or will help you mature appropriately. And then we have BIA on Demand, which is really our business impact assessment tool. In fact, I was just in that right before this session, making some updates, working with the client on their BIA. But again, others will use this for their own BIAs, or they'll take it and leverage it. So it's a full BIA data gathering tool and reporting tool. The next is a Planner and BCM1. They kind of go together. This is where you can actually build your business continuity plans as a place to do that. It's online. It allows you to maintain, send out automated emails for updates, and it's kept all there. And then BCM1 ties into that, which is a location to store them in case there actually is a need to leverage them. It comes up, you can click on a location, within a map, and the plans that have been developed will be there to actually be used. It also includes some incident management, some basic incident management and tracking functions during an incident as well. The last one is something called residual risk. It's really for very mature organizations. Once they've implemented all of these other aspects of your program and you've done some risk remediation, you can look at what else is left from what you've done. Not something that you're necessarily going to do until you've done really a mature implementation of a program. But this is out there. If you're ever interested, we're happy to share that with you and get you in contact with the leader and the manager of this environment. So what are we going to talk about today? Is really what does it mean for an effective disaster recovery plan, and what does it mean for usable and appropriate information and instructions? Shirley, so why you need something, what are the strategies, how do we make sure we integrate, and then making sure that the necessary content, organization, and options and strategies and things are included as well as keeping the document relevant. That's kind of the whole point today. Some of this information you may have heard in the past, especially if it's you've worked with us or you've seen some of our presentations, whether it be webinars or other things. A lot of this information really remains current, but we want to remind folks of this as well. So the biggest thing, I like this Steve Jobs quote, I use it a lot, that simple is really what we're looking for, right? Focus on simplicity. And often that can be very hard over the complex. It's easy to get very complex and get overly detailed and go about, well, it depends. And all of a sudden it goes from something easy to, 10, 15, 20, 50, 60 pages that really isn't usable because it's hard to leverage. So taking the time to make things clean and simple is really what we're all about, because once we do that, then people know what to do and we can actually make great strides. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, especially when it comes to disaster recovery plans, we want to make sure that we understand recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives versus actuals. So one of the things there is we think about a recovery time objective, and that's always what's going to happen. That may not necessarily be what has been implemented by IT, meaning recovery time objective is when something needs to be available or recovered. That's a time frame. Could be minutes, could be 0, could be hours, days, weeks. And so one of the important things for IT and from business continuity is to make sure we understand this is what our organization is requesting, or the requirement is coming out from a BIA, for example. But this is actually what's been implemented from an IT perspective as it relates to technology services. Those can be different. And there may be a reason for that on both cases, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. The second one is the recovery point objective. This is about data loss, right? This isn't everything, but it's about a state of once things are recovered from a technical perspective, how much data is no longer there that is going to require manual re-entry or recreation. It's the backup. It allows the IT team to understand what are the backup requirements from a crisis or a disaster recovery perspective that we do. We always try to beat that, but there may be a need to do it, and this is the maximum time that could be. In the same state, there's an objective, could be, we want it to be minutes, but IT's implemented an hour or 2 hours or 8 hours. So understanding those deltas are really important. The other thing to make sure we understand is funds are not unlimited. The shorter things get, the more expensive it gets. So it's easy to say I need it immediately or I want to have as little as possible, but we need to understand what actual needs and capabilities are, because if you get it down to as fast as possible to immediate, that means you're spending millions and millions of dollars potentially. So one of the things that I've been making some distinctions on recently is making sure we understand the difference between a plan and documentation. Often we kind of mix these two concepts together, and we'll get people coming in and saying, we want a plan. And what they really mean is somebody's asking us for a document, and we want a document that explains what we can, what our disaster recovery plan actually is. It's the documentation side. And often it's almost not relevant because they really don't have something in place, or it really doesn't meet the need, and you don't want to necessarily do that. So want to make that distinction is the plan is actually the solutions, communications, preparations, actions, everything that you're going to do in order to recover, right? That may or may not be documented, but you have a plan. It's like anything, right? In many things in our lives, we don't have a documented plan or a documentation on what we're going to do, but we know what to do. And that's the most important is, do you have a plan? and is it effective, and will it work? Then there's, now let's document the necessary information to support that plan so that I can execute the plan as appropriate, as opposed to saying this document is my plan. That's not necessarily the case. So I hope that makes sense. And I think as continuity professionals, we really need to make a distinction between our plans and our actions and our strategies and the documentation that we use for that. And as you can see there, the documentation is really that necessary information to effectively recover, or that people need in order to recover. It's often multiple documents that might be associated with it. Individual technologies may have an individual document. There may be a communication document. There may be an overview document that's given to outside parties, auditors, etc., that help with training or information sharing. So make sure you really keep that distinction between the plan and the documentation. Some things might be very formal. Some things may be more informal, maybe sitting out on a wiki, they may be sitting out on SharePoint or something that people are going to reference, maybe other referenceable information from diagrams to lists. That's all okay as long as people know how to use it. The last thing is on here is we want to make sure that there are regular updates and information that are needed, so that the documentation itself, as well as the plan, are reviewed on a regular basis based on different criteria. It could be based on change management. It could be based on, at least an annual review to make sure nothing has changed significantly. But it really should be part of that overall productionized processes that you have. So why do we want to spend time recovering both plans and documentation? One of the most important things that I hear a lot, we're in the cloud, we're SaaS based, we're whatever it is. We don't need it anymore. Somebody else is responsible for it. But in the end, or look, our people are really smart, we'll just figure it out. But that's not necessarily the case, right? People are smart. They would figure it out. The issue is, how long will it take for things to be figured out, right? Or everybody knows what to do. Well, they know what to do day to day. They don't necessarily know when something major goes wrong, right? Our normal troubleshooting, we often get a little bit too, confident in our ability to solve problems every day, when a disaster kind of event can be very different, because we either haven't practiced it or it's not something we do day to day. Also, when somebody says everything's just scripted, well, is that really true? Are you sure everything is scripted? We just click. Have you tested it? Do you know? And then actually one of the biggest things that we see is the dependencies during a major event are really not completely understood. Things are built so quickly. Things are applications and environments are spun out there. New systems are brought on. Non-IT environments or business units will go out and get a SaaS solution, and all of a sudden they'll work with that team to integrate some data, and nobody knows about it. All of those things really need to be addressed. That's what's becoming more critical from a DR perspective, is making sure we understand the integrations, even if it isn't about I have to recover that service because somebody else was responsible for it. The integrations are really the key piece. So kind of talked a little bit about this, but it's one important thing to remember is why DR is most events are actually self-inflicted. We do something wrong. It's not just something breaks, right? It breaks because we have done something. We've introduced a change. There's been a bug in there that now rears its head, right? We're so reliant on third parties, as I mentioned. Public cloud default protections are not necessarily sufficient. I hear this all the time. I'm using Azure, I'm using AWS, I'm using Google. They have all of the protections in place. The reality is they don't. They have some defaults that may be sufficient for day to day, but they don't necessarily take into account DR. For example, when we think about regional events, right? People may think, oh, Amazon or Azure has everything protected. So if where my stuff runs, it automatically fails over to another data center or another portion of their environment. That's true potentially if you've set it up correctly, but if a whole region goes down, that isn't necessarily set up already. You've got to go through the process of making sure it's there, and that costs more money. So you really need to understand, what are the protections, what do you need? Again, BIAs, understanding requirements. It's no different when you're using cloud solutions than when you're actually using on-premise or data center based like we did 15 years ago. The other thing I always like to mention is people will say, well, our customers will understand, and the reality is they won't. If you think about what your customers expect, even internal and external customers, if you look at something and say, well, we've had a failure, and somebody and you're like, oh, they'll understand. They'll be like, and you didn't prepare for it? So they won't necessarily understand. The expectation is people want it when we want it. We become a very immediate need culture in today's world. When we talk about the team will know how to execute, I've kind of mentioned this and just reemphasize. Day-to-day problem solving is not disaster recovery problem solving. Or people will be tired. People will be, they'll be working on environments they're not quite as familiar with because the help is needed. There's multiple recoveries going on. It isn't just recover one server or recover this one piece of data. It's everything. And then there are problems with it, and they're troubleshooting, and they're struggling through, or they've got 14 people coming and talking to him, asking him to do that. It's very different than when you're just doing something day to day and you can prioritize. The other issue is you may be using secondary resources, or as we've talked about, the hosting providers, the SaaS providers, the cloud providers, you're going to be working with them, and they're going to be asking specific questions that maybe they're not as familiar with your business or the integrations or how you've done things, or they didn't even know you were doing it because it's self-service. All of those things are necessary, hence the documentation. We've kind of talked the figure it out part is really about understanding things up front. You will figure it out. I have no question that the technical people will figure it out. It's just how long. That's the issue, right? Do you actually know all the dependencies? Do you know the complexities that go on? Actual databases that are there? What middleware? What network configurations that need to be done? Because it just hasn't been done. It just runs. Also, there will be unexpected issues, even in the best of cases, which means people are going to have to figure it out. And it often comes down to, I didn't think of XYZ. I didn't think of that configuration. Oh, I forgot we put this special thing in place, but we haven't done it for 2 years, and nobody remembers that it's there because it's just been running. And as we've said, often the actual recovery or the implementation, in the absolute best case, will meet the RTO or RPO, but in reality, because you start adding in the problems, the people, it actually doesn't meet that. And so there is that limiting factor. And then you've got the situation of recovery environments are not always in sync with production. So there's a case where, yeah, we've got backup set up or we've got replication, but nobody's monitoring it. And the next thing you know, it's out of date by a day or 2 or a week. And I've actually seen that happen when we've gone into tests. Before we do a test, somebody will go check and they'll realize, oh, I've got to go fix that before the test because the replication hasn't worked, or we forgot to put a server in our protection. Well, it's like, and so when the exercise happened, everybody's like, look, it worked well. And I'm like, no, it didn't. We had run the test. When you found that issue, everything would have failed. So you've got a problem. Your 2 production environments aren't in sync. And so understanding that from a documentation perspective, that's kind of the whole point of when you have to keep things up to date and you have to document, you're looking at it to make sure it's already there. So from a documentation perspective, since that's kind of, once we have our plan, we've got everything implemented, or maybe you're still working on implementing your full plan, but you need to document something in case you have an event tomorrow, right? So having something is better than nothing. But one of the most important things you can do is use current documentation or information that you have. And when I say documentation, I don't necessarily mean a formal document that somebody's out there that's version controlled or anything. I mean any information, documentation that's out there. Could be a picture, it could be an architecture diagram, could be just notes that somebody have out there. But pull all of that together and leverage that so you don't start from necessarily just from a completely empty or blank piece of paper. Look at your production changes, especially as you're using change management. What things are being implemented? What's there? Or if you go back to the change management, that's information that you can leverage. Here are the servers that I've implemented. Here are the changes that I've made. You can kind of pull all of that back, especially if you haven't done anything for a long time. You go back looking over your changes, it can start saying, oh, I forgot, we made this network change, or we made this configuration change that nobody remembers about. So leveraging your production changes and change management can be a big help in developing documentation and making sure you understand. The other thing, often getting documents done is just hard, right? Nobody likes to necessarily do documentation. But if you do exercises, even if it's just tabletop exercises, how would I recover? What's my steps? How do I have to go through that? And then you document and you write all of this down, and then you're actually documenting your plan during the exercises. So you're leveraging, it's a 2-in-1, right? It's multitasking, if you will. And then the last thing is start a phased approach. As I said, something's better than nothing, right? 20% is better than zero. 50% is better than zero. So a lot of times people are going to spend hours and days and weeks until they get this perfect document, and they never have anything because it's never perfect. So even if you start at a high level, here's my overall strategy that I would use, right? And I put down some of the major tasks that need to be done in a checklist form. That's great. And that's going to be very useful. And then you can continue to look at that and develop out detail as appropriate. Some things may need more detail, other things will not. So it's really okay for this to be phased. It doesn't have to be perfect, nor should it. I would ever want it to be perfect, right? Perfect is the enemy of good. We want to start with good and then ultimately get there. So on top of leveraging the information you have, right? Now, when you start actually looking at your disaster recovery plan, you want to leverage the business requirements as we talked about. What is the organization really saying? And you really want to make sure you have those business impact assessments, or at least have a conversation. Several organizations that I've dealt with, I will go after a BIA, I'll go talk to them and say, hey, this is what we're seeing from a DR perspective. And the question is, this isn't what we've architected. We've architected everything to be immediate availability or almost high availability with zero data loss. I'm like, okay, why did you do that? It's like, well, because we just get pounded every single day to make sure things are available. So there's a difference between availability and disaster recovery, right? Day-to-day availability is one thing. We expect it to be up. We don't want to lose data. We got to make sure that's there. That's one thing. But being able to recover during an event, that's very different, right? The priorities are different. Certain things don't have to be up, especially when we think about operational resiliency. So understanding those business requirements, then the strategies can be developed and put together. Again, when we think about this overall plan, what are the appropriate strategies, technologies, solutions, how I'm going to do that before we even get to the documentation side. So understanding that will allow you to put in the appropriate technologies and solutions, which then allows IT to be very flexible. As things move, they can move things from one to another. They might be able to expand a recovery. They might be able to bring it back. But not every environment is the same. Also, we want to make sure that environments are not just critical, right? Don't just do a plan for the critical things. You need to look at the overall environment. We see that a lot, right? People come in and say, we put this great disaster recovery program together, and all they've done are the top 10. That might be where you start, but if you don't look at everything else, ultimately you're using those systems and applications for a reason, right? And if they are, they're ultimately going to have to be recovered. And if you're just going to do that ad hoc, you're going to be in trouble. Make sure that as you're looking at your plan, you're looking at all of the integration requirements like I talked about. I can't emphasize that enough, especially the SaaS solutions, things that your IT team is not responsible for. Authentication, right? How do you log in? And in today's world, that's becoming more complex. There might be things like the single sign-in solutions, such as Okta, OneLogin, and others, or Microsoft's. But those are often SaaS-based. And so when you start looking at your recovery, if that hasn't been taken into account so that you can ensure that your authentication will still work at your alternate site or across however it's recovered, that's going to be a problem because you won't be able to log in. Might be easy, might already be there, but you need to take it into account. Also, don't forget point-to-point solutions. Those point-to-point connections are really key. And those are the things that often get lost because we think, oh, everything is just over the intranet. But when you start looking at either legacy applications, information that's been shared for a long period of time, or because of certain security issues, there might be point-to-point connections. And if those aren't addressed, that means when you recover somewhere else, that point-to-point connection is gone because it's point-to-point. You don't have something in place already to go to an alternate data center. From a SaaS perspective, it might not be an issue, but you want to address that and make sure you haven't put something in because of security or because of a need. And when you recover, that's broken because often those point-to-point connections are not something that you can just build out in real time. It takes provisioning, And it could take at least hours, if not days, and in some cases, a week or more. And then lastly, start thinking about your data synchronization. Again, as we talk about all these complex environments, from cloud to SaaS to on-prem, to people keeping things on their local machines, and maybe they have a network drive, whatever it may be. Understanding that actual data synchronization, often the assumption is it will heal itself. That's not necessarily the case, depending on the data protections that are in place. One system may be a replication, so the data loss is minimal. Another system may be recovered because that's all that needed. And now those two systems are out of sync. How are you going to get them back in sync? Something that's in your replicated system isn't in your other system because it interfaced over, but the backup that was restored from is from 8 hours ago or 24 hours ago. And so that interface piece that's sitting in your one system isn't in your other system. And now there's a conflict. And how is that going to get synced again? Will it automatically happen? Maybe, maybe not. Do you understand how that works? So synchronization is key across all of these. So again, this is not even documentation yet. This is just about what is your actual recovery plan? Do you have the strategies? All those things in place. Again, making that distinction between documentation and your actual DR capability or plan. Okay. One of the things we've talked about, implementation and changes. I can't emphasize that enough. Leverage that where you can. But when you're doing your technology testing and validation, from an implementation perspective, that also is something that you'll be able to leverage and use. So don't forget about that. As you're coming in and you're implementing something, that's the time to be looking at your DR capabilities, your DR documentation is at production implementation time, not after. Most organizations realize, I haven't done it, I got to get this project done. It gets put in, we'll do it later, and then later never happens. Hence, either at your exercise time or in an annual event, you're like, oh, we got to get all of this updated. We need to prep it. We didn't put any of this in place. Well, as soon as you start saying that, you should be very concerned, because that means your DR plan and your DR environment will not work, right? It works as a test only because we've done all of this 3 months worth of prep. That's the worst thing that you can do, is do 3 months of prep and then say, look, our DR works. If you have to do 3 months of prep for a DR test, your DR environment is not functional. Full stop. Okay, so now when we think about the documentation side of things, what really needs to be there, right? You don't necessarily have to put, those items that are clearly understood, right? If there are actions that the teams or a competent professional knows, you don't have to put that in there. But focus on institutional information, right? What is actually different from a standard? Thinking about it this way, if a consultant comes in, what information do they need? Or a contractor comes in that's capable, what information are they going to need in order to recover your environment? It may not necessarily be all the button clicks on the technology, but it may need to be, what are the names? Where do you have things stored? Where are the backups? How have you architected this that might be different from standard, right? Again, technology or environment specific information. Exceptions that are out there, that you've made conscious decisions that if somebody looks at it and says, that's a problem, but in your environment, it is not a problem, right? Those can be important. Again, the integrations, special configs that are going to be needed from a recovery perspective. Maybe there's a certain firewall configuration. There might be a certain access config that's there, or maybe you're working around your authentication or your single sign-on in order to get there. Those are the things that need to be addressed in your documentation. Also, what validation are you going to do beyond just saying it's up, right? I always suggest at least a little bit of login and go beyond just, do you get a login prompt? Go beyond that. Check out some data. Check out some functionality, both from a infrastructure perspective, but also from an application perspective. You often are going to want to have architecture information to reference. If there is something going wrong, if there's a problem, being able to pull out the architecture, this is how it's supposed to look, or this is how it looks in production. Here are my differences. If you've got it documented, these are my differences in DR. At least you can compare those two and look through it. And then lastly is, what personnel is actually needed? Are there specific skill sets, specific knowledge? When are you going to hand off from a system administrator to a database administrator? Or when within the process, maybe there's a step where the network team has got to step in and make a change. halfway through certain system recovery or database recovery because of needs. So making sure all of that communication, personnel needs are there and appropriately staffed. You can't just assume that one person can do it on a day-to-day basis, that one person can do it during an event. Think in terms of actual event, not test. I can tell you many times when we sit down, people spend time documenting for the test, and it's very specific to the test. And then you look at it and go, well, what would happen in a real event? Oh, well, half of these steps aren't pertinent. Well, that's not what we want. We want to get the steps that are pertinent for an event, and then you can have an appendix or a separate section for test-related activities. But your actual documentation should be based on the event, not a test. Test is not event. Test demonstrates your capability. Make sure you include everything that's needed, right? Don't just put applications or just server and storage. Don't forget about load balancers and remote access and certain security appliances, all of those things. Third-party dependencies that are going to need to be done. Who are you contacting to make sure it's working on their side? And again, you keep hearing me say integration and communication between the sites. Is that working? Is there configuration? Is there something that needs to be turned on there as well? But again, think in terms of an actual event, not a testing event. I've got a client, and when we talk through this, they say, well, our test environment, we basically just put everything behind a firewall and the network is completely open. It's like, well, is that what we're going to do in a real event? Absolutely not. Well, if that's what we've documented, then in a real event, we're in trouble because we don't have any of those. Either those other things aren't in place, or we haven't documented how we're actually going to set that up in a real event. We just are worried about the test, and that's all everybody goes through, because that's what we do on a regular basis. I think I've talked through all of this, but just to make sure, we've talked through, the supporting technologies are really key beyond just authentication and load balancing, but also manual steps due to maybe administrative tools or systems that are not going to be coming up. So if you have to do something, if you've got administrative tools that you're not going to be bringing up during maybe the tier 1 phase because they really are a help, they're administrative, does that mean there's manual steps in the recovery, or there's manual steps in the setup that need to be done because your administrative tools, such as server monitoring or other types of user monitoring isn't there, that are automatically sending data? So don't forget some of those manual steps that would have to be in there. Again, that's a very important documentation piece that might not necessarily be needed from an overall strategy perspective. Or you may find as you're documenting it that is going to be so painful, or it's going to be so difficult to do, that those administrative tools actually become a supportive and a dependency for the actual recovery and have the same recovery time objective. And then don't forget about exception processing as well, right? Are there changes in backups that you need to do? Are there performance exceptions that you need to be prepared for? Or even availability exceptions that need to be there. If something is typically going to be up and available 24/7, but it turns out that because of the way it's architected, because of the size and the performance, you're going to have to take things down to do a backup separately because it doesn't have the capacity or the hardware capability to do that while it's functioning in production. Also, there are some cases where people will make a decision, it's not a good one, but they will, that they will share hardware. It's like, well, we really only need this to run 3 days a week and we can get the work done, and then we're going to take it down and we're going to bring this other one up that maybe is less critical because we've had to, we didn't have the budget to get everything in place. Well, that's going to be an availability or performance, and then that feeds back into the business continuity team to make sure their plans are addressing when things will be available and how long and how people will continue to work. Don't forget about, and this code is more specific about some of the validation pieces that I mentioned before. These are some specifics, especially when it's out of the norm. What is your expected usage from a technical perspective? Memory, CPU, storage, right? It might all look green, but when somebody looks at it and says, wait a second, that's way low or that's way high, something isn't right, even if it's technically running. That could mean something's missing. There might be data that isn't there. It could be that their services aren't running because the CPU usage or the memory usage is so much lower. That's going to give you some of the initial red flags or indications that maybe something isn't in the state that it should be. Also, number of servers that should be running in the VM environment, right? Yeah, everything appears to be running, or somebody got a login prompt, but it turns out that there's a critical server that isn't necessarily part of login that needs to be there to help transfer data, and that wasn't there. And if we had just known, this is how many servers we typically have running per host or in the environment, now we know we're missing 5. Let's go up and figure out what's going on. Same thing from a services perspective. This happens all the time, especially when we're doing tests, right? Everything fires up, it's working, people can log in, but then partway through the test, something fails. And then you go spend an hour troubleshooting, and you realize, oh, a service didn't start. Well, if we know what services are supposed to be there, what services need to be checked as a validation, you can correct that so much quicker. And it doesn't mean that people can't start. It just means that we're not going to see that problem in the future, or in an hour or two when we could have caught it while we're done and we're sitting back just waiting for somebody to notify us. And that goes back to just don't assume that the environment is up, everything is correct. Because in most cases, up does not mean fully functional. And to the point that I was just mentioning, right? 15, 30 minutes, an hour of time spent verifying things will save potentially hours of troubleshooting and frustration if we catch it ahead of time before somebody calls, and now you've got to figure and troubleshoot it through. Because again, that's I have to go figure it out now. What service should have been there? I don't know. I'm not used to what services run. That's not something we necessarily always have memorized. Integrations, all right? Make sure, and this is where as I was saying before, from a detailed perspective, right? There are so many different types of integrations, and we just assume they all will work. But when we start thinking about some of the more older types of technology that could be file-based, could be a direct database connection, but maybe it's only turned on at certain points, right? Could be an FTP, could be through VPN. Again, it could be SaaS pieces that are scheduled, depending on what it is. The timing and movement, and again, this goes back to the synchronization state. Something might kick off, and all of a sudden on the other side it isn't there, and now you're getting hundreds or thousands of errors because what's being sent, the synchronization is off, or the information that needs to be there isn't, and so it's now kicking errors, which is causing data not to flow, is causing troubleshooting issues. All of those things need to be addressed so that you know what's there, when, how, especially on a permissions perspective. A lot of times when we start recovering things, permissions might get messed up. It might not change the functional use of the application itself, but as the data is flowing, there's a permission wrong, and now a file doesn't move, or data fails because the permissions were incorrect. So all of this integration pieces really needs to be considered in your plan and then potentially in your documentation. So kind of from an organization perspective, and this is just kind of very basic, one of the things that we see a lot in documents is the first 10, 15 pages are all of the purpose, description, why, who's this for, what are they going to do, right? It talks about, it's kind of policy, and I like to sometimes call it policy, audit, external party information. That's important, and it's not inappropriate to put it in your document, but that may be a separate document, or put it at the bottom. What we really want to get to when it comes to a disaster recovery document that's related to execution is put the actionable content up front. So when you open it up, the first thing it tells you is this is what you should do, whether it's communicate to this team, identify the issue, prioritize tasks, whatever it is, but so that you're not looking through something that it's like you have to go through 10 pages, rip those off because I need to get to something that's relevant to me. So just think about the organizational structure. Things that are informational based should be at the back. The actionable things should be at the top. And again, kind of the reference and audit and those type of things, that can either be, often we're moving that to a separate document so that that can be updated, because rarely does it change. And then that can be provided as needed, as opposed to the actionable that actually may have some proprietary or intellectual kind of property information that you just don't want to get out necessarily. Now, Integrating plans together. This is really key from a DR perspective because we've got IT sitting over here doing its work, but then we've got business continuity activities going on. There might be crisis management activities going on. So making sure that the support requirements are really separate from recovery execution. So if it's a technology recovery, that's happening. But if it's another kind of business continuity issue, maybe their IT's in support mode. They're not necessarily doing anything from a recovery perspective. So understanding what those technology needs are, how are people working differently so that they can be prepared within their plans to support maybe different use of laptops or a different access method, whatever that may be. Number of people who are going to access things over time may be different. Changes to business processes, because they're changing those business processes, access is different, or the amount of usage is going to be different. Maybe it goes up or down. Communication of information and requirements, approvals, and then as I just might have mentioned, technology that needs to be recovered, may be not included in the actual ITDR plan when we start thinking about end user devices, or it could be security keys, remote access requirements to banks or other service providers, right? And then more also very important is that shadow IT stuff that people have started to implement without having to go to IT because it's just something that's web-based. We signed up for the subscription, they're using it, but is there a need to understand what that is done? So last thing is one of the things that we like to really go through here is exercises are the most important thing you can do to ensure that you're prepared in your plan and your documentation. Do that with individual or several environments, not just a once a year type of thing. More frequent and doing a lot of tabletops and walkthroughs can be just as beneficial as actually failing things over. Not saying we shouldn't fail over, we really should, but we kind of focus on that. We spend so much time doing that and planning it that that's kind of the only effort that we do. My goal for organizations is, as I said earlier in this discussion, is if you have to spend 3 months planning a DR exercise, you really need to rethink where you're at. You should be able to do that very quickly, and you want to be able to do that. Get the environment set up such that you can almost do that at will and say we're going to do a DR exercise here. The only planning that you may have to do is getting people scheduled. But if you have to have multiple meetings, that's the problem part. Make sure that you're always using secondary, tertiary resources, not just the ones who are going to be available or wrote the documents or are the experts. Find the other people that are there. Integration tests. I know we've got several organizations that do a very good job of doing their business continuity activities with a DR test at the same time. That's really helpful. Integrating with partners, especially in today's world. They might do their test, you might do yours, but is there any way you can come together and do any of that so you can see the data flowing and you understand how you're going to interact together? And as I said, tabletop reviews we're finding very, very beneficial because then you can actually look at a full recovery from a DR perspective. You can start all the way from what do we do if something goes down and all the systems are down. When we're just doing an actual recovery exercise where we're failing things over, we just don't have the time, resources to do it. But at tabletop, you can talk through all of that and you start finding a lot of gaps. I've actually found more gaps doing those tabletops from a full recovery perspective than just doing a limited or the in-scope applications that we fail over every year. So looking at your criticality, obviously I said you have to do the overall environment, but definitely prioritize the development of your plan based on criticality and then keep going. Don't just stop once you get to tier 0, tier 1. Go to the tier 2, tier 3, continue that through. Make sure the recovery tasks and validations are there. Make sure that, look at the environments that don't have documentation. Do they need it? And then as we, where to prioritize, making sure that we've got infrastructure, right? If you can't recover from an infrastructure perspective, everything else doesn't matter. So prioritize that, but the integrations, then any gaps, resource constraints, your SaaS, IaaS environments, and then validating your recovery. So just think about where you're at across the path. And you may be at a different place for the different tiers that you have. You may be golden for tier 0 and tier 1, but you need to start dealing with the SaaS environments or validating the recovery strategy. Whereas for the tier 2 and tier 3, you haven't even considered the base infrastructure needs that are going to be needed for recovery. So that's where you start there. So look at this not necessarily as a comprehensive that everything has to be there. Think about it in terms of the tiers that you're doing. I think we've gone through all of this here. We prioritized, what you can do, checklist based, as I put the functional things up front. Getting something is the most important, and really focused on the outcome, and being target focused, not just getting something in place so that my auditor leaves me alone or my business continuity person leaves me alone. Focus on functional as opposed to just having something there. I would rather see a 2 or 3 page checklist that's usable than a 20-page document that basically is just a bunch of words that says, we will do something if it happens. Really, what are you going to do? That's really all I had. Thank you for being here. Thank you for joining. This recording will be sent out to you, as well as the information. If at any point you have any questions, my contact obviously is on here. I am more than happy to take a phone call, take an email. We'll spend some time, spend a few minutes with you on any question at all. That's just something that we do from an MHA perspective. We like to give back. We like to provide information. Obviously, I can't spend 2 hours with you, but 15, 30 minutes, more than happy to just give you some of the advice and insight that we have gathered over the 20 years that we've been doing this. So don't hesitate to reach out at any time. We thank you, and we'll let you get back to your day. Thank you for participating with us today.